History remembers Viking glory but buries their darkest crimes. We picture them as fierce raiders, sea kings, and warriors who shaped the north. But what came after the battles, when the swords fell silent and the fires dimmed, is the part the sagas rarely dared to tell. When the shield walls broke and the last cries faded, another story began, one too grim for most chroniclers to write. It wasn't the fallen who endured the worst. Their pain was over. It was the ones left behind, the wives, the daughters, the survivors, who entered a nightmare that history tried to erase. What they faced made death a mercy, and yet, every fragment of evidence whispers that it truly happened. If you value history told without filters, the kind that uncovers what others buried, make sure to subscribe, share with someone who values history as well, and stay with us until the end. And let us know in the comments which city you are watching from. All that follows is drawn from real records, from Ibn Fadlan's eyewitness accounts to the evidence unearthed beneath the soil of Dublin's harbors. Now back to the story. The monastery at Conmachno fell to Thorgils and his fleet. 43 monks were slain at the altar, their resistance brief and desperate. The chronicler's pen grows quiet after that, silent about what befell those taken alive. But the ground remembers. At Dublin's Wood Quay, excavations revealed the remnants of a slave market. Rusted chains shaped for smaller wrists, ankle rings that once held children, and stone foundations built to store human cargo. The Norsemen didn't only plunder treasures, they plundered lives. In the markets, human worth was measured in silver, 20 pieces for the young and strong, less for the weak or wounded. Cold calculations, carved into runic stones in Schleswig, record trade that speaks louder than any saga. And yet, for some, to be sold was a twisted form of survival. In 862, Viking ships struck Port Morrow. The Irish annals tell of warriors slain, but nothing of the 53 women seized from the longhouses. Centuries later, soil studies near the bogs reveal what those scribes could not say. Signs of deliberate harm, patterns too precise to be chaos. These were not victims of battle, but of decisions made afterward. The same pattern appears again and again. In 871, the great heathen army took reading. Chronicles recall King Ethelred's defeat, but the royal household vanishes from the record. Archaeologists working at the old Saxon palace found floors discolored with traces of blood and ash, silent testimony to those erased from the written page. Norse war culture followed strict codes. By law and custom, the spoils of war included the families of the fallen. A warrior's wife became the property of his killer, a grim inheritance defined in the Old Norse word kona, owned woman. The law even recorded the ritual. Before witnesses, the conqueror would claim ownership. The woman had no voice in the matter and no escape. Icelandic law codes like Gragas left no room for doubt. The claim had to be made within 3 days, or others could contest it. Rival warriors fought not only for land and treasure but for the right to possess another human being. But there were darker fates still. In 878, Norse raiders burned the monastery at Bangor to the ground. The annals record its destruction but say nothing of what followed. Burn layers from similar sites tell the unspoken truth, deliberate patterns in the remains, suggesting rites far older than Christianity. When a Viking chieftain died, his wealth, his weapons, and sometimes his companions were sent with him into the grave. Ibn Fadlan witnessed one such rite on the Volga in 921. An enslaved girl sacrificed at her master's funeral. Archaeology across Scandinavia confirms that it was no isolated account. Boat burials reveal women laid beside warriors, their bodies bearing signs of ritual death, traces of herbs used to dull the senses. Whether mercy or manipulation, no one can say. By 907, the great army wintered at Thetford. Chronicles mention livestock stolen and churches destroyed, but the true story lay buried in the waste heaps. Small bones, broken and burned. The records show what the scribes did not dare admit. In Norse society, the enslaved were expendable. Infants born of captive mothers were often killed if they could not be used. Harsh logic disguised as law. Even a century later, the Doomsday Book still reflects the same shadow, the same cold arithmetic of human life. Population gaps in regions of Viking settlement hint at entire communities erased. Excavations at Repton, once the Great Army's camp in 873 to 874, uncovered 249 skeletons. Only 63 were women. The rest were missing, carried away or lost to the slave routes that webbed across the Norse world. Isotope analysis of the bones tells another truth. The women buried there were not locals. Their chemical signatures trace back to Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Those fortunate enough to be buried likely died of illness or exhaustion. The rest disappeared into the machinery of a trade that spanned continents. Viking Dublin was more than a harbor. It was the center of a vast network of human trafficking. Ships arrived weekly, bearing new captives. The young were sent to Norse farms, forced to rebuild what war had destroyed. The older were shipped east, along the river routes that led toward the markets of the Islamic world. Even the wood of Dublin's docks tells the story. Tree ring dating reveals continuous rebuilding from 841 to 970. 6 decades of steady expansion. Not for fishing, not for furs, for something far more profitable. Each new quay meant room for more ships and more captives. The warehouses that stood above the waterline were not mere storage halls. Their foundations were reinforced to hold the weight of hundreds, with narrow drainage channels carved through the stone. The evidence suggests they were built for long-term confinement, a system efficient, cold, and inhuman. Arabic travelers of the 9th century described Viking caravans reaching as far as Baghdad, where northern women fetched the highest prices. To the buyers, they were rare and foreign curiosities. To the Vikings, they were merchandise. This was not chaos, nor isolated cruelty. It was a structure, an economy, and for more than a century, it flourished in silence, woven into the same Norse culture that gave us poetry, art, and sagas of adventure. If you've made it this far, you've seen the part of Viking history most refuse to tell. Not the myths of courage and conquest, but the buried truths of those who paid the price for them. Let us know in the comments which city you are watching from, and remember, the past is never as distant as it seems. The Great Eastern Slave Road stretched deep into the heart of the continent, winding from Novgorod through Kiev, following the cold ribbon of the Dnieper River for more than 1,000 miles. Along its banks, rune-marked ship manifests have been uncovered, listing names beside amber and furs, records of a trade that measured human life by weight and price. Each vessel carried around 20 women, the standard load. But captivity was not the worst fate a woman could meet. It was not sale, nor servitude, nor even ritual death. The most dreadful end awaited those who dared to resist. In 914, Irish forces retook Dublin from Norse hands. The annals of the Four Masters celebrate it as a triumph. The city reclaimed, the raiders expelled. Yet the record falls silent about what lay beyond the gates. Centuries later, the ground broke that silence. Excavations revealed stone-lined pits, narrow, airless chambers where people were left to die slowly. Inside them, archaeologists found human remains bearing signs of deliberate cruelty. Legs crushed to prevent escape, arms shattered to deny self-destruction. The victims did not perish quickly. Each pit was 6 feet deep, 3 feet wide, too tight to stretch, too shallow to stand. Those within met their end crouched in torment, fading over days. Old Norse legal codes confirm this punishment. Any enslaved woman who rose against her master was to be buried alive. Not swiftly, but slowly. The pit left open enough for air, too deep for hope. Death came through thirst, exhaustion, or despair. Soil analysis from Dublin's execution fields proves it. The decay layers show prolonged suffering, not sudden burial. Some pits were filled with sharp stones, others with stagnant water. The intent was not only death, but an example. Captives were forced to watch, a warning written in terror. By 919, King Harald Fairhair united Norway. The endless civil wars ended, but the flesh trade did not. It became efficient, structured, and predictable. The routes were mapped, the exchanges recorded. Captives could now be delivered on fixed schedules, guaranteed by merchants who spoke of shipments as though of grain. Byzantine trade documents confirm the precision. The Rus, Byzantine Treaty of 944 itemizes slave prices by age and condition. Young women commanded the highest value. Expectant mothers were discounted. Children under 10 were nearly worthless. The human market functioned with the cold logic of commerce. In 937, Ireland's 5 kingdoms rose together to crush the Norse at the Battle of Brunnen. The victory was total, yet what they found in the Viking supply wagons was far more revealing. Portable cages. These were not crude improvisations but engineered frameworks of iron and wood, fitted for transport. Chains sized for small limbs. Modular designs built to assemble and dismantle with military precision. They were, in essence, mobile slave markets moving with the armies themselves. Each pen could hold up to a dozen adults or 20 children, secured by iron rings and reinforced beams, where marks in the metal reveal how often they were used. This was no random cruelty, it was infrastructure. For the Vikings, war was not only about conquest. It was harvest. The captured were resources to be collected, processed, and distributed. Archaeology supports it. Every major Norse town possessed containment yards. Every harbor processing sites. The system was everywhere, woven into daily life. When Eric Bloodaxe fell at Stainmore in 954, the last Viking kingdom in England crumbled. Yet the machinery of slavery did not. It simply changed hands. Christian rulers absorbed the system, replacing pagan symbols with crosses, and the word slave with servant. Monastic records describe waves of indentured laborers appearing almost immediately after the Norse defeat. The labels shifted, but the people did not. By 1066, when Harold Hardrada fell at Stamford Bridge, the Viking Age was declared over. But beneath the soil, the story said otherwise. Archaeologists uncovered mass graves of women dating precisely to the years of Norse collapse. These were not casualties of battle. They were executions, evidence carefully hidden, erased from chronicles. The reason surfaced centuries later at Repton. There, a sealed pit dated to 986 held 236 bodies, all women. Each bore signs of deliberate killing. Isotope testing overturned every assumption. These were not captured foreigners. They were Norse-born. Their deaths occurred as Viking control in England unraveled. These were the wives and daughters of the raiders themselves. Why would they be slain by their own kin? Because their men knew. They understood exactly what awaited captured women, the same horror they had imposed on others. And rather than allow it to be repeated, they turned their own blades inward. Soil cores from Repton show the deaths took place over several days. Not a frenzy, but a ritual of despair. It was calculated, organized, and systematic. Fathers taking the lives of their daughters, husbands ending those of their wives. A final reflection of the terror they had once inflicted beyond their shores. The records are silent. The sagas omit the tale. But the bones speak, and one detail refuses to fade. On one skull, archaeologists found a runic inscription. 3 words, carved in Old Norse. Better this way. Someone, in that moment, believed those words enough to mark them into bone. Perhaps to justify the act. Perhaps to ease a conscience that could not bear what it had done. The skull belonged to a girl no older than 14, born in Norway, carried to England and slain by her own. The carving was made after death, as if meant to explain or to confess. And with that, the long night of the North drew to its close. The sagas sing of honor and valor, but the soil remembers differently. Beneath every Viking triumph lies another story, one not of conquest, but of what humanity becomes when power is mistaken for destiny. Viking cruelty wasn't random. It was codified, carved into law, and sanctified by custom. The Gragas codes from Iceland laid it bare. A man's claim over a woman had to be declared before witnesses, not to ask for her consent, but to establish ownership. Whether she resisted or not was irrelevant. The law treated her silence, her struggle, even her death, as mere inconvenience. If a captive woman ended her life rather than submit, her family was bound to compensate her captor. The act wasn't seen as defiance, it was theft. The price set by the law, 40 silver marks. That was more than a free man could earn in a lifetime. By 978, King Athelred ascended the throne of England. His first decree did not condemn Viking slavery, it regulated it. He taxed it. Customs rolls from London list duties collected on human cargo. 5 silver pieces for a woman, 2 for a child. England wasn't horrified by Norse brutality, it envied its profit. Archaeology fills in what records omit. From the North seafloor, ships have been raised with their secrets still intact. Purpose-built vessels with air shafts, water casks, and reinforced compartments designed not for trade goods, but for living freight. These weren't improvised. They were engineered for endurance, to carry human lives across weeks of open water. The largest could hold 80 souls below deck. Charred timbers show how it ended. The ship burned at sea, taking its captives with it. But not everyone accepted the role of victim. In 923, Frankish chronicles mention a woman named Gunhild, once a Norse captive, later a scourge of the Vikings themselves. She turned their own warfare against them, using their tactics, their timing, their fear. For 7 years, she led raiding bands through Frankish territory, dismantling Viking outposts and liberating hundreds of captives. The records credit her with destroying 12 Norse camps. Her reprisals were merciless, swift, unrelenting, deliberate. Her last known strike fell upon the slave market at Rouen. Every trader she found there perished. After 930, she vanished from the chronicles. But in the burned layers of Viking settlements across northern France, her ghost remained. Someone, somewhere, was hunting the hunters. Someone who knew exactly how to unmake their empire. Yet the practice she defied did not die with the Vikings. It evolved. When the Normans crossed the sea in 1066, they brought the same system, refined, legitimized, and sealed by royal charter. Norman chronicles describe land grants that listed not only cattle and grain, but also women among the property. The Doomsday Book preserves it still. Female dependents tallied beside livestock and plows. The language of empire turned women into assets, valuable but replaceable. Excavations of Norman fortresses reveal the architecture of control. Holding chambers built for women alone, their walls cold and narrow, their doors sealed in iron. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of infants nearby, mortality near total. This was not neglect. It was designed. The children born from forced unions were erased before they could live. It was policy, quiet, systematic, merciless. When Harold Godwin's son fell at Hastings and the English crown changed hands, Saxon women became the spoils of the new order. Marriage became the instrument of conquest. What law called union was often just conquest rewritten in parchment and seal. Chroniclers claimed it civilized the Saxon bloodline. Modern words would call it something else: ethnic cleansing through ritualized domination. Medieval marriage contracts exposed the machinery behind the language. Saxon brides fetched high prices, not for affection or lineage, but because their lands transferred with them. Property by another name. Their consent was irrelevant. Their value was in what could be taken. The church became a witness and beneficiary. Some women fled into convents, the only sanctuary left. In the decade after Hastings, the number of nuns tripled. So did the number of deaths among noblewomen. Many were canonized as saints. The state called them losses of property. Science now reveals what the chronicles refused to say. Genetic studies trace the pattern clearly. Maternal bloodlines absorbed, overwritten, displaced. Mitochondrial DNA from modern Scandinavia tells the same story etched into bone. Celtic and Saxon ancestry appearing within Norse populations from the 9th century onward. It wasn't migration. It wasn't an exchange. It was generational violence, repeated until memory itself fractured. In Iceland today, 60% of female ancestry descends from Celtic women, captives once taken across the sea. In Norway, the number is 40. Each percentage point marks thousands of vanished lives. Women whose names never survived, whose children inherited a story they were never told. And beneath the numbers, archaeology whispers of something darker still. At Jorvik, modern-day York, excavations uncovered the remains of a stone structure dated to around 876. Inside were 64 narrow cells, chains bolted to the walls. Soil samples prove it was used for nearly half a century. This was no dungeon for prisoners of war. It was something else, an institution dedicated to exploitation, hidden in plain sight at the heart of the city. Human remains within show women of varied ancestry, local, Celtic, Norse, all bearing traces of exhaustion and repeated childbirth. When they could no longer endure, they were replaced. Church records from the same period mention the site indirectly, baptismal lists naming hundreds of children with no known parents. Most did not survive infancy. The few who did were recorded as foundlings and later sold into service. Ledger books from York Minster contain entries of regular payments to the operators of that facility. Not hidden, not scandalous, but routine. The church was not a bystander. It was a partner. The same pattern appears everywhere Norse or Norman influence spread. Every major settlement had its holding structures, its lists, its profits. The trade was vast, the system efficient, the silence absolute. And at Repton, where the great burial pit of Norse women was found, new studies uncovered the final truth. The grave was not from one night of slaughter. The soil reveals layers, decades apart, proof of a repeated purge. A cycle of elimination, executed methodically over generations. These were not random deaths. They were the quiet erasures of those who had seen too much, women who knew how the system worked, who could not be allowed to speak. Some of the skeletons show traces of mercury, administered over time, warping the mind before ending the body. The madness was no accident. It made their testimony worthless. Among them lay mother and child, buried together, silence made complete. And on one skull a familiar mark, the same runic phrase carved long ago. Better this way, confession, a surrender, or perhaps a final act of mercy from someone who knew there was no mercy left to give. The sagas end with glory. The earth tells another story. In the soil, in the bones, in the DNA, the echoes remain. The empire of the North was built not only on conquest, but on the quiet destruction of those who could not fight back. And the ground still remembers every one of them.